I want you all to know how much your presence means. Really, really and truly. It lifts my spirits to see your faces and to see that we have a relatively good chunk here and online, and people who are longing to understand God better. Times of trial and difficulty, I think, bring about that side of us that realizes that the nature of a fallen world is not enough to quench the longing of the heart. When everything is paradise, or seeming to be so, with prosperity and good jobs and good health and good entertainment and all of that, it becomes very difficult to see and remember this is not home. And I appreciated Dean in the prayer a moment ago praying that we would all get to heaven. That is what we're doing. That's why we do this. That's why the elders shepherd here. That's why the deacons serve here. That's why I preach here. That's why you all come here. We want to go to heaven. We believe in a place after this world. This world is not my home. And the reality is that while we are focused deeply on eternal salvation and that prospect, which we're convinced is to be true, that is not the reality for everybody right now. In fact, it is not the reality for the vast majority of the world. We started last week looking at, in Romans chapter 1, which I go ahead and open to that section of scripture because that's where we're going to be. And you can go ahead and stay there for the next 2 months. Romans chapter 1, we started last week looking at the concept of the wrath of God. And we really just established the fact of it, the fact that it is there. It is, the wrath of God is the antonym of the gospel of God. In the gospel of God, God receives men to himself. He redeems men. In the wrath of God, he casts men away from himself. And we looked at the fact of that matter last week. This week and in the coming weeks, we're going to look at why God is maintaining wrath. What is it that incites the wrath of God? And ultimately, how does that fit into a letter which is about the gospel, the good news of God? Now, I want you to keep in mind this really critical point as we go through this subject matter. Because as I've been studying it, Paul continues threads and even direct expressions concerning the wrath of God all the way until about chapter 5. Not that that's going to be the main focus of all of it, but his flow to kind of get us understanding it completely is going to go all the way to chapter 5. So there's going to be some lengthy sections and a number of Sundays that we're going to be spending talking about this. And the thing we need to keep in mind as we go through this is that the end game of Paul in bringing out the wrath of God is not to say that because right now there's a group of people against whom God's wrath is coming, and because there is a people who right now are on a trajectory and a path to eternal destruction, his point is not to stop there and say that's just the truth, that's just the basic fact of it. It is, but his ultimate point is to show that for those people, there is an alternative. For those people who currently are under the wrath of God, for those people who currently right now are on a path to hell, there is an alternative, and it's called the gospel. Let me show that to you. Let me prove that point to you, because I don't want us to get lost thinking about God's wrath as though this is it. It's set in stone. Paul's point would be that the wrath of God is against all unrighteousness. So if you're not in Christ, then you're just an object of that, which would be the call to come into Christ. It would be the call to the gospel. In chapter 1 and verse 18, he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness." Underline that word in your minds. Then in chapter 5, verse 6, He says, for while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. So in chapter 1, and for the subsequent chapters, he's going to spell out the wrath of God in great detail. We're going to see what it looks like right now as it's being manifested in the lives of men and women in 2020, in America even, in a very crystal clear way. But look at where he goes with it in chapter 5. At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. The wrath of God is being borne out on ungodliness. But at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. You see the connection that he's making there. And he goes on, he even says this in chapter 5. God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And listen to this. Since, therefore, we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. That's chapter 5, to get all the way to that point. So there's great detail about the wrath of God and the reality of it, and it is a terrible situation. It is the opposite of gospel. But look where he goes with it. It highlights we need to understand that reality in order to present the gospel effectively. You can't present the gospel to somebody, which is the good news of their salvation, without them knowing and understanding intimately what the alternative of it is. You can't, and again, I brought this point out last week. If there is no hell, if there is no wrath from God, then what is the good news of salvation? It isn't good news. Good news of salvation from what? If there is no hell, then you're not saved from anything. And you may as well continue on doing what it is that you desire. So we're going to become really thoroughly acquainted with that knowledge, which is going to provide, I think, the firmest backdrop for presenting the gospel, the greatest news. We are a church that shares gospel. We are a gospel-centered church. Christ is at the center. Salvation is our goal. And we will keep that in mind as we study God's wrath, knowing where this is going. But today, since we put a pin in that, today we are going to look at what it is that incites the wrath of God most fundamentally. What is it, you know what I mean, when you think about it, that would make an almighty, sovereign, infinite God most angry with his creation? And what is the context of it? If your idea going into the message is that God simply doesn't like rule breakers, I hope that this message will destroy that kind of thinking. That is not the basis of God's wrath. It is that just a rule was broken. There's something a lot deeper than that. Let's look at Romans 1. Let's start in verse 18 and read through 22. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Paul tells us immediately, verse 18, why God is angry. And there's a couple of things. In fact, there are a couple of activities that men do that he summarizes as ungodliness in general and unrighteousness in general. And I think those two are the same thing. Whatever is ungodly is also unrighteous. Whatever is unrighteous is also ungodly. And that's one part of it. That's kind of like the preliminary activity. But the fruit of those two things is what God is chiefly mad about. And it actually explains why God hates unrighteousness and ungodliness so much. Because those two things collectively produce something that he calls the suppression of the truth, which is what we're going to look at this morning. We are going to come back next week. I'm going to talk extensively about ungodliness and unrighteousness and how they're manifested in the world and what that has to do with all of this. But as I've studied through these, through this chapter and through the next couple of chapters, the main thing Paul keeps going back to that incites God's wrath, and the reason why he's mad about petty sin and grand sin is because always it suppresses the truth. This is why God is most angry with his creation. Suppression of the truth. So that begs the question, or it prompts the question, what does God mean by the truth? What is it that is being suppressed? The word that he uses for suppressed, it means to be restrained. It means to be held back. And it basically means that it's kept from being kind of unleashed. That's what's happening. So what truth is having that done to it? That's the question. Is he just talking about some aspect of the law of God? Is he talking about the words that God has revealed to the world through the Bible? Is he talking about the Bible? Is he talking about the Ten Commandments? Is he talking about covenant relationship with God? Is he talking about Jesus? What truth is it that is being suppressed always by unrighteousness and ungodliness of men? To understand it, you simply have to follow the flow of Paul down through verse 25. Let's do that. I'm going to read. I'm going to read a few verses. I'll tell you which ones to go to. First of all, look at verse 19. So he said, "Who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." Verse 18. "Now, for what can be known about God is plain to them." That's your first clue as to what is being suppressed. For what can be known about God. Verse 21. "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him." Verse 22. "Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, mortal birds, mortal animals, mortal creatures, creeping things." Verse 25, this is it. "They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who's blessed forever." Verse 25 explains precisely what it is that is being suppressed by unrighteousness and ungodliness. What is the truth that they were suppressing? He started off by saying what can be known about God, some general things that can just be known and understood about God that would leave a person knowing I should not worship creature. I can't worship creature in any way, whether in an idol or in a lustful gaze. I should not worship creature because creature isn't creator. And he says they exchanged the truth about God. The truth, that's the truth. The truth that was being suppressed is there is a sovereign, reigning, immortal, uncreated, uncaused, infinitely almighty and all-powerful being over all the universe. and he is worthy of all worship and all praise of all men at all times. That's the truth. And then he says, they're suppressing that, which means something else is being esteemed. If you suppress one thing, then you are esteeming something else. And the thing that was esteemed, the thing that rose to the top, as they pushed down God, they pushed down the truth that there is indeed an almighty God over all the universe to be worshiped. As they suppressed that, then the cream that rose to the top is creature. And that's what ended up being worshiped. This is the most basic and deepest understanding for why God hates unrighteousness. Because unrighteousness and ungodliness always happens when we push God down and elevate creature in some form. The creature may even be myself and my desires. And when that creature goes to the top, God goes down. I suppress the truth of God that he should be worshiped. And I esteem the truth that I would have to worship what it is that I particularly fancy. Now, I want to spend the rest of our time answering what I think is a very likely objection. And it's a very likely objection because I've seen this objection many a time. And it's a very likely objection because Paul anticipates it and he responds to it. So we can back out for a second and we can understand a couple things. We know God is wrathful. We know God has wrath. We know that he is upset. Not just, that is a very, very lame word for it. He is appalled and it's inciting his wrath because of what he sees. This is God. And we know that men have suppressed the truth of God. That's why he's wrathful. Now, what about a person who says, but I don't believe in God, right? I don't believe that there is a God. And therefore, God is not righteous to get on me or to be wrathful against me for suppressing a truth that I have never even come to know, that there is a God over the universe. I never came to know that. I don't believe that. I'm an atheist. So God, you can't be mad at me. I'm not suppressing anything. I just didn't know. The objection comes out in statements like that of the famous atheistic philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was once interviewed and asked the question, let's say you get to the end of life, and let's say you were totally wrong about Darwin, and wrong about evolution, wrong about your ideas of creation, wrong about your atheistic notions, there really is a God over all the universe, and you come face to face with him, what would be the thing that you would say to him? He said this, I would probably ask, sir, why did you not give me better evidence? Now, that comment is really a post-Darwin contention. Paul is not writing to a post-Darwinist. In fact, he's going to be talking about some people who are worshiping something they would call a god. He's talking about pagans. He's talking about Gentiles. These are not people who would expressly say that there is no such thing as a God, which is why it astounds me that Paul actually answers the objection of somebody like Bertrand Russell. And the reason why is because the end result of Bertrand Russell, who says he doesn't believe in God, and a pagan Gentile who believes in a million gods, one of them being a crocodile, is that the creature is ultimately worshipped. Bertrand worshipped himself and whatever it is that his body desired during all the days of his life. But I think that basic question asked by somebody like Russell is going to be what makes people feel like they should be excused before the throne of God. And Paul actually points out that they will not be excused. This is what he says. The Holy Spirit objects to the excuse of someone like Russell who thinks that because there was not better evidence, he should be able to live his unrighteous, unbelieving, unfaithful rejection of the gospel life. This is what God says. Verse 19. Verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and ungodliness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. They are actually actively suppressing the truth, and therefore God is mad about that. Bertrand Russell, you shouldn't be mad about that because I'm not suppressing the truth. I didn't know the truth. Verse 19, what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Bertrand Russell, sir, why didn't you give me better evidence? God, I gave you plain evidence. I showed it to you every day of your life when you walked outside. So that's astounding. What is the plain, because those are the words he uses. What can be known about God is plain, like right there. What plain evidence that God will say, you are without excuse because I showed you. What is it? Look at verse 20. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Now, I laughed a little bit and I marveled a lot this week over that statement, because the objection to a wrathful God bearing down wrath on someone who suppresses a truth that they claim they never knew, because I don't believe in God, so you can't be mad at me because I didn't suppress it, because I didn't know it. The objection from them would be, you did not give me evidence. Why? And then God says, no, my invisible attributes. God owns that he's invisible. That's the objection. God, why didn't you open up the heavens, look down and wave at me and drop a Bible into my lap? I'm excused. And God owns it. I mean, he doesn't even try to get around that. Yes, invisible, totally invisible, but inexcusably perceivable. This is what he says. Invisible, but inexcusably perceivable, and apparently they're understood by looking at the creation. Two things of God, Paul points out, that anybody with a rational brain can step out into the creation and see, apart from any human credentials, philosophy degree, biology degree, whatever other degree we have created for man. There are two things that God has made so plain, so clear, so perceivable, so evident to everybody in the world. There will not be a person on the day of judgment who will be excused before God by saying, you didn't give me good enough evidence. Everyone will stand condemned who rejected the evidence that God calls plain, that God says he showed, that God says is plainly perceived, clearly perceived. He doesn't just say, you could have kind of found it. He says it was right before your eyes, all your days. And this is what he says. They were invisible, but inexcusably perceivable, and these were the two: his eternal power and divine nature. Now, these are how that would look. When you go out into the world and you look on creation, you look on the Grand Canyon, you look at the Milky Way outside of Oklahoma City where you can actually see it. You look at the grasshopper, you look at the beating heart of man and the way that it brings blood to every part of his body. You look at the brain of man that is so intricate and so involved that we don't even begin to understand how it works and how it holds all this information and how it functions and how we can be conscious. And you look at all of these systems in the human body that are so perfectly systematized and working together. Two things can be known without any kind of degree. One of them is there must be somebody that made this. And whoever it is must be eternally powerful. Those are the two things that no soul will be able to escape, because Paul is saying every soul at some point in their life knew that to be the case. This is what astounds me. We've esteemed science in this culture so high. Traditionalists, creationists, those who believe in the Bible fundamentally and primarily are said to be people who don't believe or esteem science. The thing that's misunderstood is that we actually esteem, first of all, the one who made science. Science can only find its rightful place under the God who invented and the God who made it. And all of the greatest scientists who've ever lived, from Newton to Galileo, understood this fact to be true. They presented their scientific findings. They came at science from the understanding that the only way any of it could make any sense was with there being a God. And the closer that we look, and the more that we examine, and the more that we get into our telescopes to look out and into our microscopes to look in, the more thorough and the more complex things become. Infinite, it seems. When Darwin wrote his propositions, when Darwin developed his theory, he did not have the slightest clue as to the complexity of the cell. Not even the slightest clue. And even our best scientists today will admit we don't either. It is so intricate. There are so many systems at work in one cell that you can't even see with your naked eye, that some of the best scientists have come to the conclusion there had to be a designer. This stuff can't just fall into place, and chaos never makes order. Chaos never makes order. This is a scientific law. Chaos never makes order. And apparently, that fact alone is enough to leave somebody totally excused. In fact, that's what he says in verse 20. For those people who will have the wrath of God over their lives because they rejected the gospel, he says, so they are without excuse. They are without excuse. They cannot offer an excuse before my throne. And this is something that I find incredibly fascinating. He says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. Their foolish hearts were darkened. They claimed to be wise and they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the image representing mortal man, mortal birds, mortal creeping things. Although they knew God, the people that reject Almighty God to chase anything other than him, whether it be to esteem the God of science or to esteem the God of crocodile, any of them, he says they knew God. This is in the aorist. It happened. It's a fact. They knew God, but they did not choose to honor him. Now, as I thought about it and contemplated more, I realized God, Paul is not saying they knew God in the way that Jews knew God. They did not know that his name was Jehovah. They did not have covenant with him. They did not know the 10 Commandments necessarily. What he means by although they knew God points back up to verse 19. For the things that can be known of God were plain to them. This is the sense in which they knew God. They knew those two things of the invisible attributes of God, namely his eternal power and namely his divine nature. They knew those two things. That's what he means when he says they knew God. They knew those two things. They didn't necessarily know the Bible, but those two things should have been enough to bring them to go find out the Bible later on in some way. They knew God, but they didn't honor him. This is why they're not going to be excused. And this is why God is so greatly angered. This is why God has such wrath. This is why he says that it's a suppression of the truth. They knew it to be true. I remember when I was studying at Bear Valley, our president, Denny Petrillo, one of my professors, in fact, somebody who taught Romans, I remember he told a story about there's a national park in the state of Texas where you can go and actually see dinosaur tracks. I'm sure there have been some people here who have gone to see it. Well, in this park, this is a fact. You can go look this up. Right there, stamped into the dinosaur footprint, crossing it, is a human footprint. Okay, which eliminates a lot of things that our scientists have theorized or claim to be fact. Dinosaurs and men didn't walk together. Well, okay, how do you explain that? They've even studied the layers, getting in and looking at it through these amazing lenses that they have to kind of study the layers of it. They found that it actually happened after the dinosaur footprint, but became firm at the same time. So this happened at the same time. And in this national park, somebody way back when, I think sometime in the 20th century, late 20th century, went and poured acid onto that human footprint and tried to scrape it out. Suppression of the truth. It doesn't fit with what they've stated to be the facts. It shows that what they've theorized isn't true. Suppression of the truth. This is why God is so angry. If you meet an atheist, he may be an atheist right now, but he wasn't always. And I've told the story before about Joseph Stalin, one of the greatest mass murderers of all of history. Not great in the sense of being a great man. Greatest numbers. Mass murderer. Horrible person. Lived his life as an express atheist. Said there is no God. But his daughter, on his deathbed, as he was getting ready to pass from this life to the next, he sat up in heaven and he shook his fist to the heavens, angry at a God who he said didn't exist. He knew he existed. And he was there all along. And the wrath of God, if you want to know why God hates sin so much, why God hates unrighteousness so much, why God hates rebellion so much, why God hates anything that's outside of covenant with him, is because always it involves the suppression of the truth about the eternality and sovereignty and righteousness of God, and it esteems something in the creation. Next week, we're going to talk and connect creature worship to unrighteousness and ungodliness and how that bears out. And then in the coming weeks, we're going to look at what God does in the lives of men when they choose to do that. And I think it will hit home for us. If you're outside of Jesus this morning and you want to know him, the good news of the gospel, and we spent several weeks looking at this in Romans 1:16, after a message that points out the wrath of God, I want you to know it. If you're under the wrath of God, I want you to know that. because it is the backdrop of the greatest news in all the world. You need to know that. Don't think that if you're outside of God that, well, yeah, it's going to be kind of it's not going to be fun. Don't think of it like that. It's the worst. It is the worst condition you could ever be in. If you're not living righteously, if you're not living for God, if you're not giving him all of your being, if you're not loving him more than any other creature, including the creature of self, the wrath of God is there. But I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for your salvation. If you believe, because in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith. Just as it is written, the one who is righteous by faith, he shall live. So this morning, if you're under the wrath of God, but you do have faith in that God and in his son who he crucified to be a sacrifice to redeem you from his own wrath, then you can come forward and make that confession and believe in your heart and give your life to him and be baptized in water and have those sins to be washed away. If you need that to be done today, please do that now while we sing this song.